The sun did not merely shine on the high desert of the Arizona Territory. It struck the earth with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer. It was the kind of heat that dried a man's sweat before it could bead on his skin. The kind that turned the red dust into a fine powder that settled in the creases of eyelids and the deep lines of a face. The year was 1878, though the land itself seemed to care little for the calendars of men. Here, time was measured in the shifting of shadows across the sandstone mesas and the slow, inevitable erosion of the canyons. High up on the slope of a jagged ridge, a cabin sat like a stubborn scar against the rock. It was built of rough-hewn logs and mud, blending so perfectly with the landscape that a traveler might miss it entirely unless they caught the glint of the sun on a metal bucket or the thin wisp of smoke rising from the stone chimney. This was the home of Tashi Nez. Tashi stood by the corral, his hands working rhythmically to mend a section of the fence where a restless Mustang had kicked loose a rail. He was a tall man, with shoulders broad enough to carry the sky, or so his mother used to say. His hair, black as a raven's wing and streaked with the premature gray of a man who has seen too many winters in his soul, was tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore the clothes of a man caught between two existences, heavy canvas trousers tucked into worn cavalry boots, a faded calico shirt, and a silver concho belt that sang of his dying heritage. He did not speak to the horse that watched him with dark, liquid eyes. He did not curse when a splinter drove itself into his thumb. Silence was not just a habit for Tashi, it was a fortress. Below him, stretching out like a tawny hide drying in the sun, lay the valley. To the east, the land belonged to the Din, the people. To the west, the encroaching lines of barbed wire marked the cattle ranges of the white settlers. And stuck right in the middle, like a festering splinter, was the town of Dry Mesa. From this height, the town looked insignificant, a collection of wooden boxes scattered in the dirt. But Tashi knew better. He knew the noise that came from that place, the clatter of wheels, the shouting of drunks, the relentless pounding of iron on iron. He finished the fence and wiped his hands on a rag. The silence up here was pure, broken only by the wind sighing through the twisted branches of the juniper trees. He preferred the wind. The wind did not lie. Tashi moved to his small garden, checking the traps he had set for the rabbits that plagued his meager crops. He found one jackrabbit. Its life ended quickly by the heavy stone of the deadfall. He lifted it with a practical reverence, whispering a silent thanks to the animal for its life. Words are traps, he thought, his mind drifting back to a time he tried hard to forget. White men use words like they use whiskey to confuse you, to make you warm, and then to leave you with a headache and empty pockets. He remembered the uniform he once wore. He had been a scout, a young man foolish enough to believe that if he helped the blue coats navigate the treacherous canyons, he could buy safety for his family. The captain had given him his word. Help us find the renegades. Tashi, and your village will be under the protection of the United States Army. I swear it. The memory hit him with the physical force of a punch to the gut. He saw the smoke rising not from an enemy camp, but from his own hogan. He heard the screams that cut through the crackle of flames. He had returned to find ashes and silence. The captain had been transferred. The new commander claimed no knowledge of any deal. The renegades they had hunted were just families trying to hide. And Tashi's own family, his mother, his father, the girl with the laughing eyes who had woven him a blanket for their future marriage were gone. He had buried them. And with them, he had buried his voice. He returned the uniform, stripped of its buttons, and walked away into the high country. He swore then that he would never trust a promise made in English again. He swore he would live untouched by their wars, their greed, and especially their women. Love was a luxury for men who did not have blood on their hands. Tashi skinned the rabbit with practiced efficiency, his knife sharp and sure. He washed his hands in the bucket of water drawn from the spring. The water was cold, shocking his skin. He looked at his reflection on the rippling surface. A warrior who fought no one, a man who spoke to no one. Silence is safe, he told himself. Silence does not betray you. Miles away, on the dusty road that snaked its way toward Dry Mesa. A stagecoach rattled and groaned as if it were in pain. The red dust kicked up by the 6 horses coated everything in a fine, choking grit. Inside the coach, the air was stifling, smelling of old leather, stale sweat, and the lavender water Evelyn Hart had dabbed on her handkerchief. Evelyn sat rigidly upright, her spine not touching the back of the seat. She was 22 years old, though her serious demeanor often made her appear older. She wore a traveling dress of heavy blue wool that was entirely unsuited for the Arizona heat, high-collared and long-sleeved, buttoned all the way to her chin. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely under a bonnet, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to stick to her damp forehead. On her lap lay a leather satchel. Inside it was a holy Bible, its cover worn from her father's hands. Beneath the Bible, hidden like a shameful secret, was a thick volume titled The Principles and Practice of Medicine. She kept her hand resting on the bag, her fingers tracing the raised spine of the medical book through the leather. "It won't be much longer now, Evie," her father said, patting her knee. Reverend Hart was a man of soft hands and high ideals, his face perpetually flushed from the heat and his own enthusiasm. "The driver says we shall reach Dry Mesa before sundown." "Yes, Father," Evelyn said. Her voice was soft, trained to be pleasant and unobtrusive. "Mr. McAllen will be waiting," the Reverend continued, beaming. "A fine man, a pillar of the community. From all the letters. It is a great blessing. Evie, a man of his means doesn't look for a wife from back east unless he wants quality, virtue." Evelyn forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jared McAllen." She tested the name on her tongue. It tasted of iron and dust. "He owns nearly half the valley now," her father said, unfolding a crumpled map for the 10th time that hour. "Railroad money, Evie, the future. He writes that the railroad will turn Dry Mesa into a metropolis within 5 years, and you will be the first lady of that city." Evelyn looked out the window. The landscape was alien to her, violent, vast, and terrifyingly beautiful. Giant saguaros stood like sentinels with their arms raised in surrender or warning. The rocks burned with colors she didn't have names for. "I only hope," Evelyn started, then hesitated. "Hope what, child? I hope I can be useful there. Perhaps I could assist Dr. Miller, or whoever the town physician is. You know I have a knack for—" Now, Reverend Hart interrupted gently but firmly. "We have discussed this. Mr. McAllen is a man of stature. His wife does not bandage drunken cowboys or deliver babies in shacks. Your duty is to his home, his comfort, and the church. You will bring civilization to this wild place. Evie, that is your calling." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, Father." She looked back at the medical book hidden in her bag. It was the only thing that made sense to her. The logic of the body. The way bones knit and fevers broke, that was a world she understood. The world of men like Jared McAllen, with their land deeds and railroad contracts, felt like a cage closing in around her. She had read McAllen's letters. They were polite, devoid of warmth, and focused entirely on acquisition. He wrote of the land as something to be broken and tamed. He wrote of the Navajo as an obstacle to progress that needed to be removed. "They say the savages are restless," the Reverend murmured, looking out at the distant purple hills. "But Mr. McAllen assured me the army has them well in hand. Savages, he calls them. God's children, I suppose. But lost in darkness." Evelyn shivered despite the heat. "Is it true what they say, that they scalp women?" "Stories, likely," her father said, though he checked the small pistol he kept in his coat pocket. "Fear makes storytellers of us all. But we have the Lord's protection, and Mr. McAllen's influence. No one would dare touch the future bride of Jared McAllen." The stagecoach hit a rut, jarring Evelyn's teeth. She grabbed the strap to steady herself. Outside, the world seemed vast and indifferent to her small, orchestrated destiny. She felt like a parcel being delivered, prepaid and insured. "A good wife," she repeated internally. Obedient, silent. The irony was bitter. She was traveling 2,000 miles to a land of open skies only to be locked inside a parlor, back on the ridge. Tashi wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down. His sharp eyes caught the movement in the distance. A cloud of dust moving steadily along the canyon floor. The stagecoach. It looked like a toy from up here, a small black beetle crawling across the immense red earth. He knew that coach. It came once a week, bringing mail, whiskey, and more people who wanted to own things that could not be owned. He watched it approach the entrance to the narrow canyon that the locals called the Throat of the Wolf. It was a dangerous place, a natural ambush point where the walls rose sheer and high, blocking out the sun. "Turn back," he whispered, though he knew the wind would carry his words away. "Go back to your cities of stone and smoke." He saw the driver whip the horses. The coach picked up speed, desperate to clear the pass before the light failed. Tashi turned away, picking up his rifle not to use it, but because a man did not walk these hills unarmed. He headed back toward his cabin. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and blood orange. He remembered the words of Hosteen Bege, the old medicine man who lived in the village 2 days' ride to the north. Tashi had visited him just 3 days ago to trade deer hides for cornmeal. The old man had looked at him with eyes that were milky with age but saw clearer than any hawk. "You live like a ghost up there." "Grandson," Bege had said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "You think because you do not speak. You are at peace, but silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just another prison. A man can scream without making a sound, and that scream will tear him apart from the inside." Tashi had not answered. He had simply taken his cornmeal and left, but the words had followed him up the mountain. They sat in the corners of his cabin like unwanted guests. A prison. Tashi thought now, looking at the rough walls of his home. Maybe, but it is a prison I hold the key to, and no one enters unless I allow it. He tried to focus on the evening chores. He needed to chop wood for the fire. The nights were still cold this high up. He swung the axe, the satisfying thwack of metal biting into pine echoing off the rocks. Thwack! Why did he feel this unease? It was a prickling on the back of his neck, the same sensation he used to get before a skirmish, before the air filled with the smell of black powder. He stopped, the axe resting on the chopping block. He looked back toward the valley. The stagecoach had disappeared into the shadow of the canyon walls. The dust it had kicked up was settling back onto the road, erasing the evidence of its passing. The town of Dry Mesa was lighting its lamps. Tiny pinpricks of yellow light flickered in the distance. Down there, men were drinking and boasting. Jared McAllen was likely sitting in his study, drinking fine brandy and looking at maps, drawing lines through the homes of the dying. The people in the town called Tashi and his kind savages. They told their children that the Navajo would steal them in the night. They did not know that the Navajo called them Bilagana, the white people, but more specifically, the ones who came now were the liars with wire. They brought fences. They brought paper that said the land was theirs. Tashi spat on the ground. He wanted no part of it. Let them have their town. Let them have their railroad, as long as they left him this patch of sky and these silent rocks. But the feeling would not leave him. It was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that was unnatural. He walked to the edge of the cliff, his boots crunching on the gravel. He squinted against the dying light. Below, the canyon was swallowing the last of the day. The shadows stretched long and thin, like fingers reaching out to grab the unsuspecting. And then he saw them, a flock of crows, black specks against the darkening sky. Rose suddenly from the rim of the canyon. They were agitated, circling and diving. Birds did not fly like that for no reason. They flew like that when something disturbed them, when something loud and violent broke the peace of their nesting grounds. They were flying low, too low. Tashi stood frozen, his hand tightening on the stock of his Winchester. The silence of the mountains seemed to amplify the beating of his own heart. He told himself to turn around. He told himself to go inside, light a fire, and cook his rabbit. He told himself that whatever was happening down there in the white man's road was none of his concern. "Not my business," he said aloud, his voice rusty and rough from disuse. But even as he spoke, the echo of the stagecoach's wheels seemed to vibrate in the soles of his boots. He could almost hear the laughter of the men in town, the arrogant confidence of men like McAllen. And beneath it all, he imagined he could hear something else, a sound that wasn't there, or perhaps was carried on the wind of memory. The sound of a woman's voice, soft and terrified. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the high desert turned a cold, steel blue. Tashi Nez did not go inside. He stood on the precipice, a warrior fighting a war against his own conscience, while down in the dark throat of the canyon, the trap was already springing shut. The shadow of the canyon fell over the stagecoach like a shroud. The pass, known to the locals as the Throat of the Wolf, was narrow, the red walls rising so high on either side that the strip of sky above looked like a jagged blue river. The air here was cooler, stagnant, and heavy with the scent of pine resin and dust. The driver, a weathered man named Elias, who had driven this route for 20 years, tightened his grip on the reins. He glanced up at the rim of the canyon, his eyes darting nervously. "It is quiet," Elias muttered, more to the horses than to the passengers. Too quiet. Inside the coach, Reverend Hart patted Evelyn's hand again, though his own palm was damp. "Do not worry, my dear Mr. McAllen assured me in his last letter that his own men patrol this road. We are quite safe." Evelyn looked out the window. The beautiful, terrifying landscape of the previous hours had vanished, replaced by oppressive stone. As the coach rounded a sharp bend, something caught her eye, a fresh stake driven into the earth near the canyon wall. It was painted with a bright yellow stripe, the mark of the surveyors. Railroad, she thought. Even here, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the stillness. It was not the dramatic thunder she had imagined from stories, but a sharp, flat sound, like a dry branch snapping. The lead horse screamed and went down, tangling in the traces. The coach lurched violently to the left, throwing Evelyn against her father. "Father!" she cried out, grabbing his arm. Before the Reverend could answer, a volley of shots rang out. Outside, Elias gave a short, choked grunt and tumbled from the box, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The coach ground to a halt, dust swirling around the windows. "Stay down! Evie, stay down!" Reverend Hart shouted, pushing her toward the floorboards. But the door was wrenched open. A rough hand grabbed the Reverend by his collar and dragged him out into the dust. "No, please!" Evelyn scrambled up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stumbled out of the coach, her skirts tangling around her ankles. 6 men on horseback surrounded them. They wore long dusters and hats pulled low, their faces obscured by bandanas. They did not look like the desperate, ragged outlaws of dime novels. Their horses were well fed, their weapons clean and oiled. Reverend Hart stood trembling, his hands raised, a small Bible clutched in one hand like a shield. "Gentlemen, please, I am a man of God. We have very little money, but you are welcome to it. I am Reverend Hart, the father-in-law of Jared McAllen." The leader of the riders sat atop a massive black stallion. He looked down at the trembling priest with eyes that showed no more emotion than the canyon walls. "We know who you are, old man," the leader said. Reverend Hart lowered his hands slightly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "Then you know, Mr. McAllen will pay you handsomely for our safe." The leader raised his revolver and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the Reverend in the chest. He staggered backward, a look of profound confusion on his face, before collapsing into the red dust. Blood, bright and shocking, sprayed across the hem of Evelyn's white traveling dress. "Father!" Evelyn screamed, the sound tearing from her throat raw and primal. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, useless against the crimson tide soaking his shirt. "Father, look at me, look at me!" The Reverend's eyes glazed over, fixed on the strip of blue sky. He was gone. Evelyn stared at the blood on her hands. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was not the romance of the West. This was not the noble frontier. This was a slaughter. Above her, the horses shifted. One of the riders laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Check the coach," the leader commanded. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Burn it!" One of the other men gestured toward Evelyn, who was frozen in shock. "What about the girl, boss?" The leader looked down at her. Evelyn looked up. Her vision blurred with tears. The bandana covered his nose and mouth, but those eyes, steel gray and flat, bored her. And the voice. She knew that voice. It was not a voice she had heard in a parlor, but it was the voice she had heard in her mind 1,000 times as she read the letters signed, "Your devoted servant." It was the voice of ownership. The voice of a man who regarded the world as a ledger to be balanced. "No witnesses," the leader said, turning his horse away. "McAllen doesn't want any mess." The realization hit Evelyn harder than a physical blow. The man who had just ordered her father's death was the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry. The savior her father had promised was the devil himself. "You," she whispered, the word dying on her lips. One of the riders dismounted, grinning beneath his mask as he reached for her arm. "Come here, little bird. Don't make this hard." High on the ridge, Tashi Nez lowered his body against the sandstone. He had watched the ambush unfold with the detached precision of a hawk. He had seen the horse fall, the driver die, the old man pleaded. His knuckles were white where he gripped his Winchester. "Do not interfere," the voice in his head warned. "This is a white man's war. Let them kill each other. If you shoot, you bring the army, you bring the law. You bring noise." He saw the rider grab the woman. She was small, her white dress stained with blood, struggling weakly like a trapped fawn. Tashi closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He saw his sister's face. He saw the smoke of his village. Silence is a prison. He opened his eyes and exhaled slowly. He aligned the iron sights on the chest of the man reaching for the woman. Crack. The rider was lifted off his feet as if yanked by an invisible rope. He hit the ground dead before he knew he had been shot. Chaos erupted below. The horses reared, terrified by the echoing report that bounced off the canyon walls, making it sound like a dozen gunmen were hidden in the rocks. "Ambush," one of the riders yelled, firing blindly at the cliffs. Tashi worked the lever of his rifle. Clack, clack. He fired again, sending dust spraying at the feet of the leader's horse. He didn't wait to see where the bullet hit. He vaulted onto his paint horse, digging his heels into its flanks. He rode down the steep scree slope, a landslide of man and beast. He was a blur of motion, screaming a dying war cry that he had not uttered in 10 years. It was a sound of pure fury, designed to curdle the blood of enemies. The riders, confused and spooked, scattered. They couldn't see how many attackers there were. Tashi hit the canyon floor at a gallop. He leaned low over his horse's neck, guiding it straight toward the woman. She was kneeling in the dust, paralyzed. "Up!" he shouted in English, his voice rough. Evelyn looked up, dazed. A savage that was what her father would have called him was charging at her. Long black hair, a face hardened by sun and wind, riding as if he were part of the animal. He didn't stop. As he thundered past, he leaned down, his arm sweeping out like a steel bar. He grabbed her around the waist. "Hold on," with a strength that seemed impossible. He swung her up in front of him. Evelyn gasped, the air knocked out of her as she was thrown across the horse's withers. "My father," she sobbed, trying to look back. "He is dead," Tashi shouted over the wind. "You want to be dead too." Bullets whined past them like angry hornets. One struck the wood of the stagecoach. A moment later, a lantern inside shattered. Flames licked up the side of the carriage, fueled by the dry varnish. Tashi didn't look back. He drove his horse up a narrow game trail on the far side of the canyon, a path no white man would dare take at a walk, let alone a gallop. They scrambled up the rocks, leaving the smoke and the death behind them. Evelyn watched the burning stagecoach shrink into a toy of fire. Her father's body was a small black heap in the dust. She clutched the only thing she had managed to hold on to, her father's blood-spattered Bible, and the world went black. When Evelyn woke, she was not dead. She was not in heaven. She was staring at the underside of a rough wooden roof. She lay on a narrow bed covered with furs that smelled of wood smoke and sage. Her head throbbed, and her body ached as if she had been trampled. She sat up slowly, panic rising in her chest. She was in a small, one-room cabin. It was sparse, clean, and silent. A fire crackled low in the stone hearth. Tashi stood by the door, his back to her. He was wiping down his rifle with an oiled rag. He had removed his heavy coat, and the muscles of his back moved under his calico shirt. Evelyn pulled the fur blanket up to her chin. Where am I?" Tashi turned. His face was unreadable. "Safe. My father." Her voice broke. "Buried in the canyon by now, or burned?" Tashi said. He did not offer false comfort. He did not know how. "The men who killed him, they would have killed you." Evelyn looked at her hands. They had been wiped clean, but she could still feel the phantom sticky warmth of the blood. She remembered the voice. McAllen. "They were not bandits," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that frightened her. "It was him." Tashi studied her. He had checked her while she was unconscious. No bullet wounds, just bruises and the deep shock of a soul that has seen the world break. He had placed her on his own bed, the only bed, and prepared to sleep on the floor. He had broken his vow. He had brought a white woman into his sanctuary. And not just any woman, a woman who carried a storm with her. "Rest," Tashi said, turning back to the darkness outside the window. "Tomorrow, we decide." Night fell heavy and thick over the high plateau. The wind picked up, whistling through the chinks in the logs. Tashi sat on the floor near the hearth, his back against the wall, wrapped in a blanket. He watched the flames dance. He was tired, but sleep would not come. From the bed, a sound drifted through the silence. "Father, no, please." It started as a whisper, a breathy plea from the depths of a nightmare. Then came the whimpers, soft, broken sounds of pure distress, virgin soft whimpers. The sound grated on Tashi's nerves like sand against skin. It was the sound of vulnerability. It was the sound of a creature that needed protecting. He hated it. He hated it because it made him want to cross the room and offer comfort. He stood up, agitated. He paced to the window, then back to the fire. He looked at the woman tossing on his bed. Her hair was spread out like a fan of gold on his pillow. Her face was pale, streaked with dried tears. "No, don't," she moaned, clutching the blanket. Tashi took a step toward her, his hand reaching out to shake her shoulder, to wake her from the dream. But he stopped. He looked at his hand, dark, calloused, a hand that had taken lives. He looked at her skin, white, soft, untouched. "Do not touch her," he told himself. "You touch her, and you take on her pain. You take on her trouble." He lowered his hand. He backed away, retreating to his corner. The whimpers continued, a soft, rhythmic haunting that filled the cabin, seeping into the wood, into the stone, and into the cracks of the wall he had built around his heart. He sat down and closed his eyes, but the silence he had cherished was gone. It had been replaced by the sound of her sorrow. Morning came with a blinding brightness. A shaft of sunlight cut through the window and struck Evelyn directly in the face. She gasped and sat up, the nightmare receding but the reality rushing in to take its place. She looked around the alien room, the skulls of small animals on the wall, the strange geometric patterns on the rugs. And him, the savage. He was crouching by the fire, stirring a pot. He looked up as she moved. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled off the bed, her legs tangling in her skirts. "Stay away," she cried, backing toward the door. "Don't come near me." She reached the door and threw it open. The blinding light of the high desert hit her. She stumbled out onto the porch, but her legs were weak from shock and hunger. She collapsed, her knees hitting the rough wood. Tashi was there in an instant. He didn't grab her roughly. He simply took her arm to steady her. "Let me go," she shrieked, pulling away. "Go where?" Tashi asked calmly. He pointed to the vast, empty landscape stretching out before them. "Look," Evelyn looked. Red cliffs, endless sky, distant purple mountains. There was no road, no town, no people, just an immense, silent emptiness. "Where are we?" she whispered. "My home," Tashi said. "Dineland, 1-day ride from Dry Mesa." Evelyn tried to stand, clutching the porch railing. "I have to go back. I have to tell the sheriff. That man, McAllen. He killed my father. I have to tell them." Tashi looked at her. She was shaking, but her chin was set. She was foolish, but she was brave. "You go back now," Tashi said slowly. "You die. McAllen owns the town. He owns the road. His men are looking for you." "I don't care," Evelyn cried, tears finally spilling over. "I can't just stay here. I can't hide in the mountains with you." "Then you die," Tashi said simply, "and the truth dies with you." He let go of her arm and walked to the edge of the porch. He looked out at the red cliffs, at the hawk circling in the thermal currents. Evelyn sank down onto the wood, pulling her knees to her chest. She was trapped in a wilderness she didn't understand, with a man she had been taught to fear, hiding from the man she was supposed to marry. She curled into a ball, weeping silently into her skirts. Tashi stood with his back to her, staring at the horizon. He could feel her presence behind him like a heat. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had forfeited his own peace. Why, he asked the wind. "Why do I always return to the canyon where the guns are firing?" He had no answer. There was only the sun, the dust, and the sound of the woman weeping in his cabin, shattering the silence he had paid so high a price to keep. The days that followed in the cabin were defined not by the passage of the sun, but by the weight of the silence. It was a heavy, tangible thing, thick as the wool blanket Tashi had thrown over the guest bed. For the first 3 days, Evelyn Hart moved like a ghost in the small space. She stayed mostly in the corner where the bed lay, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes fixed on the rough timber of the floor. She was terrified to look at him. Her father's sermons, the dime novels she had secretly read, and the whispered warnings of society ladies back east had all painted men like Tashi Nez as bloodthirsty monsters. But the monster did not roar. He did not strike. He barely spoke. Tashi spent his daylight hours outside. He found reasons to be away from the cabin repairing the corral, hunting in the lower ravines, or simply sitting on the ridgeline, smoking tobacco rolled in corn husks and watching the horizon for dust clouds. The presence of the white woman in his sanctuary was like a splinter under a fingernail, a constant, throbbing irritation that he could not ignore. He left her food on the table: roasted rabbit, corn cakes, and a tin cup of strong coffee. He left a clay pot of fresh water and a poultice made of crushed sage and willow bark for her bruises. Evelyn watched him when he wasn't looking. She watched his hands. They were large, scarred, and the color of polished mahogany. She expected violence from those hands. Instead, she saw him gently splint the leg of a hawk he had found injured near the cliff edge. She saw him carefully wipe the dust from the rim of the water bucket before bringing it inside. He moved with an economy of motion that fascinated her. There was no wasted energy. Every step had a purpose. Every glance was a localized assessment of threat and safety. He is not a savage, Evelyn thought, the realization coming with a wash of shame. He is a soldier without an army. Her guilt was a bitter pill. She had looked down on his people from the window of a stagecoach, pitying their godless existence while clutching her Bible. Yet, when the civilized men of Dry Mesa had slaughtered her father, it was this heathen who had ridden into hell to save her. On the 4th day, the silence shifted. It became less about fear and more about awkward coexistence. Tashi returned in the late afternoon with a brace of quail tied to his belt. He stopped at the door, his hand freezing on the latch. The cabin smelled different. The scent of stale wood smoke and old grease was gone, replaced by the fresh, sharp scent of scrubbed pine. He pushed the door open. The floor had been swept. The pile of firewood was stacked in a neat, geometric pyramid. The tin plates, usually left in a haphazard stack, were washed and arranged by size on the shelf. But it was the table that made him stop breathing for a second. In the center of the rough-hewn table, in a chipped cup that had lost its handle, sat a small bouquet of desert wildflowers, orange globe mallow and purple verbena. Beside them, her father's blood-stained Bible lay squarely in the center, aligned perfectly with the edge of the wood. Evelyn was standing by the hearth, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron, a makeshift thing she had fashioned from a torn piece of canvas. She looked at him, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. Tashi felt a surge of irrational anger. This was his space, his chaos, his dust. To clean it was to claim it. To put flowers on his table was to invite softness into a room he had dedicated to hardness. "I did not ask for a housekeeper," Tashi said, his voice low and gravelly. Evelyn flinched, but she did not retreat. "I could not just sit there anymore. I needed to be useful. The dust. It was thick enough to plant corn in." Tashi walked to the table. He looked at the flowers. They were small, defiant splashes of color against the gray wood. He remembered a woman from his village, years ago, who used to weave feathers into her hair just to bring color to a gray winter day. The memory was a sharp pain in his chest. "Dead weeds," he muttered, though he did not sweep them away as he wanted to. "They are life," Evelyn countered softly, "and this cabin has very little of it." Tashi looked at her then, really looked at her. The fear was still there, but the chin was lifted. She was fighting her own terror with a broom and a handful of flowers. He exhaled slowly, the anger draining away, leaving only a weary resignation. He unbuckled his gun belt and hung it on the peg. "The water bucket is empty," he said. It was an order, but it was also an acceptance. Evelyn grabbed the bucket, a small smile touching her lips. "I will fill it." That evening, they ate the roasted quail in a silence that felt less like a wall and more like a bridge being slowly constructed. "Why?" Evelyn asked suddenly. She didn't look up from her plate. Tashi paused, a bone in his hand. "Why what? Why did you save me? You hate us. I can see it in your eyes when you look at the town. You hate the white men." Tashi chewed slowly, swallowing the meat before responding. "Hate takes too much energy. I prefer indifference. You were not indifferent in the canyon." "A man does not walk past a drowning dog," Tashi said, his tone flat. "Even if the dog belongs to an enemy." Evelyn put down her fork. The metal clattered against the tin plate. "Is that all I am, a drowning dog?" Tashi looked at her across the small table. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them from blue to a deep violet. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the aftershocks of trauma. "You are a witness," Tashi said. "And that makes you dangerous. To them and to me." Evelyn took a deep breath. "The man who ordered them to kill my father. I told you I recognized his voice. It was Jared McAllen." "I know," Tashi said. Evelyn stared at him. "How can you know you were up on the ridge?" "I did not hear the voice," Tashi said. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "But I know the method." "McAllen wants the canyon, the throat of the wolf. It is the only flat passage through the mountains for 50 miles. He wants to lay the Iron Snake, the railroad, through there." "But that is Navajo land," Evelyn said. "My father said the treaty protected the reservation boundaries." Tashi laughed, a short, bitter bark of a sound. "Paper protects nothing. Iron protects. Gold protects. McAllen has bought the politicians in Santa Fe, but he needs a reason to bring the army in to clear us out. If a beloved reverend is killed by savages in the canyon, the army comes. The Navajo are pushed back. The railroad goes through." Evelyn covered her mouth with her hand. "My father, he was just a pawn. He was killed just to create an excuse. And you were supposed to die too," Tashi said brutally. "Or be taken. A grieving fiancé is a powerful thing in the newspapers. He would have used your memory to burn my village to the ground." Evelyn felt the room spin. The man she was to marry, the man her father had trusted with her life, was a monster of calculation. He had murdered the only family she had left for a right-of-way easement. "He is a devil," Evelyn whispered. "He is a businessman," Tashi corrected. "In the West, there is no difference." Evelyn looked at the man sitting opposite her, a warrior with long hair and a silver belt, eating quail with his hands. And yet, he was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. "I have to stop him," Evelyn said, her voice gaining a sudden steeliness. "I cannot let my father's death be used to destroy your people." Tashi looked at her with a flicker of surprise. He had expected tears. He had expected hysteria. He did not expect the cold anger of a survivor. "You are one woman," Tashi said. "He owns the law." "I have the truth," Evelyn said. "The truth is a quiet voice," Tashi said, standing up to clear the table. "Lies roar like thunder." Before they could speak further, the cabin groaned. It started as a low moan in the timbers, then escalated into a shriek. The wind outside had shifted instantly, as it often did in the high country. A summer monsoon storm was slamming into the mesa with the force of a physical blow. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the dust from the ceiling. Rain hit the roof like handfuls of gravel. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from above. A section of the roof shingles, old and warped by the sun, had been ripped loose by the gale. Water began to pour in, splashing onto the dirt floor near the hearth. "The roof!" Tashi shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He grabbed a hammer and a handful of nails from a shelf. "If the wind gets under the eaves, it will peel the whole roof off like a scalp." He threw the door open. The wind nearly tore it from its hinges. "I have to go up. You need to hold the ladder." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She followed him out into the deluge. The rain was freezing cold, shocking after the heat of the day. It soaked Evelyn's dress in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin. The wind whipped her hair across her face, blinding her. Tashi set the heavy wooden ladder against the side of the cabin. The mud was already slick. "Hold it steady," he yelled, climbing up into the darkness. Evelyn wrapped her arms around the rough rungs of the ladder, burying her face against the wood to shield her eyes from the stinging rain. She could feel the vibrations of Tashi's weight as he scrambled onto the roof. Above her, Tashi fought the wind. He lay flat on the slick shingles, the rain hammering his back. He grabbed the loose plank that was flapping violently in the gale. One slip and he would slide off the edge and onto the rocks below. "Hammer!" he yelled down. He had dropped it on the slide. It lay in the mud at Evelyn's feet. Evelyn looked down, then up. She grabbed the heavy iron hammer. She couldn't throw it. The wind would take it. She had to climb. "I'm coming!" she screamed over the thunder. She climbed 3 rungs, her boots slipping on the wet wood. She reached up as high as she could. Tashi reached down, his hands searching blindly in the dark. Their fingers brushed, then locked. His grip was iron hard. He pulled the hammer from her hand. "Go down!" he roared. Evelyn scrambled back to the ground and anchored the ladder again with her body weight. She heard the rhythmic pounding of the hammer thud. Thud, thud, fighting the rhythm of the thunder. For 10 minutes, they battled the storm. He fixed the breach. She held the line. For the first time, they were not a warrior and a captive, or a man and a woman. They were 2 humans fighting the indifference of nature. Tashi slid down the ladder, soaked to the bone, his chest heaving. He grabbed Evelyn by the shoulder. "Inside now." They tumbled back into the cabin and Tashi slammed the door. Throwing the heavy bolt, the noise of the storm was instantly muffled, though the wind still howled like a banshee outside. The cabin was dark, the fire having burned down to embers. Evelyn stood by the table, shivering violently. Her teeth chattered with a sound like clicking dice. Her dress was ruined, heavy with water and mud, clinging to every curve of her body. She hugged herself, turning blue. Tashi was breathing hard, wiping water from his eyes. He looked at her. She was freezing. Hypothermia in the high desert killed as surely as a bullet. He moved to the chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a thick wool blanket, woven with the red and black patterns of his clan. He walked over to her. "Take this," he said roughly. "Get out of those wet clothes. Hang them by the fire." He handed her the blanket, but he did not look at her. He turned his back abruptly. Facing the stone wall of the hearth, he busied himself with adding logs to the fire, poking the embers until flames licked up, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, Behind him, he heard the wet slap of heavy fabric hitting the floor. He heard the rustle of petticoats. He heard the soft, sharp intake of breath as the dry wool touched her cold skin. Every sound was magnified in the small space. The intimacy of it was suffocating. He had sworn to live a life untouched by women. He had sworn to keep his world hard and silent. But now, the sound of her teeth chattering a small, helpless, human sound cut through his defenses more effectively than any knife. He squeezed his eyes shut. He could remember the sound of his wife dressing in the morning. He could remember the sound of her breathing as she slept. The memories he had walled off were leaking in through the cracks that Evelyn Hart was making in his life. I am decent, Evelyn's voice came, small and trembling. Tashi turned around. She was wrapped in his blanket, sitting on the stool by the fire. Her hair hung in wet, golden rat tails around her face. Her feet were bare and muddy. She looked small, defeated, and incredibly young, but her eyes were steady. The roof held, she said. The roof held. Tashi agreed. He stayed by the door, water pooling around his boots. Evelyn pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the man standing in the shadows. He was terrifying. Yes, but he had given her his only blanket. He had turned his back to protect her modesty. He had fixed the roof to keep her dry. Tashi, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the firelight. You say you want silence, Evelyn said softly, her voice steadying as the warmth began to return to her limbs. And I know I am a noise you did not ask for. I am trouble you did not want. She paused, looking at the wildflowers on the table, which had miraculously survived the leak. If you want silence, I will be silent, she promised. I will not ask questions, I will not cry, but thank you for letting me disrupt your cabin. Thank you for saving my life. Tashi looked around the room. The floor was swept. The fire was roaring. There was a Bible on his table. There were flowers in a cup. And there was a woman wrapped in his clan's blanket, warming herself at his fire. The silence of the cabin was no longer the empty, hollow thing it had been for 10 years. It was full. It was heavy with the scent of rain and sage and woman. Sleep, Tashi said, his voice gruff, but lacking the edge it had held before. The storm is passing. He sat down on the floor in his wet clothes, staring into the flames. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he could never go back to the way it was before. The silence had changed, and for the first time in a decade, he wasn't sure if he wanted it back. The dust from Hostine Begay's arrival had not yet settled when the old medicine man delivered the news that turned the cabin from a sanctuary into a trap. He sat by the fire, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles carved by 80 years of sun and wind, holding a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly from age. Not fear. The spider weaves a web while the fly sleeps, Begay said, his voice rasping like dry corn husks rubbing together. He spoke in Dine, but switched to broken English for the benefit of the woman who sat tensely on the edge of the bed. McAllen speaks loudly in the town. He says Apache renegades, or maybe Navajo bandits, killed the holy man. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And, Begay continued, his milky eyes shifting to Tashi. He says a dangerous warrior took the white woman. He says you, grandson, are a kidnapper, a savage who stole a bride. Tashi stood by the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. If he stayed hidden, he was a guilty man fleeing justice. If he brought Evelyn back, he was a savage returning a spoiled prize, likely to be shot before he could speak a word. Then I am a dead man walking, Tashi said, his voice devoid of emotion. And I am a prisoner, Evelyn added, her voice rising with indignation. He spins lies to cover his murder. He makes himself the victim. He is a white man, Begay said simply. His words are written on paper. Ours are written on the wind. Evelyn stood up. The fear that had paralyzed her for days was hardening into something colder, something useful. My father spent his life preaching the truth. I will not let his memory be soiled by that man's lies. I will not let you be hunted like an animal for saving me. She turned to Tashi. "We go back, not to surrender, to accuse." Tashi looked at her. She was small. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was a mess. But her eyes burned with the same blue fire as the hottest part of a flame. "You do not know Dry Mesa," Tashi said. "The law there wears a badge, but it eats from McAllen's hand." "Sheriff Rourke," Evelyn said. "I heard my father speak of him. He said Rourke was a stubborn man, but a man who feared God more than money. If I can get to him, if I can stand before him and speak." "If," Tashi cut in. "It is a long road, and McAllen has many eyes. Then take me the Navajo way," she challenged him. Hostine Bigay chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. "She has fire, this one. Maybe she is not all white. Maybe she has a little red clay in her soul." He looked at Tashi, his expression sobering. "Grandson, you wanted silence. You hid here while the world burned. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes, silence is just another prison. And right now, your silence is helping a murderer." The words struck Tashi like a whip. He had thought his withdrawal from the world was a moral stand, a way to keep his hands clean. Now he saw it for what it was, cowardice disguised as wisdom. "We leave at dusk," Tashi said. The journey to the main Navajo encampment was a descent into a world Evelyn had only seen in frightening illustrations. They rode through twisting canyons and across mesas that looked like the surface of the moon. When they finally crested a ridge and looked down into the valley, she saw the Hogan's domed dwellings made of earth and logs scattered like hives among the sagebrush. The smell of burning juniper and roasted mutton rose to meet them. Dogs barked, lean and sharp-eared. Children stopped their games by the stream to stare, their eyes wide and dark. As they rode in, the rhythm of daily life faltered. Women looked up from their weaving looms. Men stopped sharpening tools. The silence here was different from the cabin. It was a silence of wariness. Evelyn felt the weight of their gaze. She was the enemy. She was the symbol of the encroaching world that brought wire and disease. Hostine Bigay led them to a hogan set slightly apart. "My niece will tend to her," he told Tashi. "She cannot go into town looking like a victim. She must look like a woman who stands tall." Evelyn was ushered into the dark, cool interior of the hogan. An older woman with silver braided into her hair stripped Evelyn of her ruined, blood-stained traveling dress without a word. She washed Evelyn's face and hands with water that smelled of yucca root. When Evelyn emerged an hour later, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and orange. Tashi was watering the horses. He turned as she approached, and the ladle fell from his hand, splashing water onto his boots. Evelyn was wearing a traditional velvet blouse the color of deep midnight and a long, flowing skirt of patterned calico. Around her waist was a woven sash of red and black. Her hair was pulled back, tied with wool. She did not look like the fragile Easter lily that had arrived on the stagecoach. She looked like a woman of the earth. Tashi felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with danger. It was a pull, ancient and undeniable. For a moment, she was not white, and he was not Dine. They were just a man and a woman standing under a vast, indifferent sky. "We ride," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "The moon will guide us to the edge of town." They could not enter Dry Mesa in the dark. It would look like a raid. They had to arrive at noon, in the open, where witnesses could see them. That meant spending the night in the wild, just outside the town limits. Tashi chose a shallow ravine, hidden from the road by a thicket of mesquite. The night air plummeted, the temperature dropping nearly 30 degrees in 2 hours. "No fire," Tashi commanded. "Too close to the patrols." They sat on the ground, the cold seeping up from the sand. Evelyn shivered, her teeth beginning to chatter despite the velvet blouse. Tashi watched her for a moment, fighting a war within himself. Then, without a word, he unrolled his heavy wool bedroll. "Here," he said. "Together. It is the only way to keep the heat." Evelyn hesitated, then crawled onto the blanket. Tashi lay down beside her, pulling the heavy wool over them both. He kept his back to her, his body rigid. But the cold was a relentless enemy. Slowly, instinctively, Evelyn moved closer, her back pressed against his chest. He could feel the tremors running through her small frame. He stiffened, terrified of his own reaction. He could smell the yucca soap in her hair. He could feel the curve of her spine. Hours passed. The moon climbed high and white. Evelyn began to twitch in her sleep. The whimpers started again. "Father, the blood, no," she thrashed, turning over in the tight cocoon of the blanket so she was facing him. Her face was buried in his shirt. Her hands clutched at his chest as if he were a lifeline in a storm. "Please," she sobbed softly, still asleep. Tashi looked down at her face, pale in the moonlight. The barrier he had built, the wall that said, "I will not touch, I will not care," crumbled into dust. He did not kiss her. He did not caress her. He simply wrapped his arm around her, his large hand resting flat and heavy on her back, anchoring her to the earth. "I am here," he whispered into the darkness, words he had never thought to speak again. "You are safe." Evelyn's breathing hitched, then slowed. She settled against him, her head tucking under his chin. Her hand relaxed its grip on his shirt, but stayed resting over his heart. Tashi lay awake, staring at the stars. He held her, not as a lover, but as a guardian. Yet, in the silence of the ravine, he knew the line had been crossed. He was no longer just saving a life. He was holding a piece of his own soul that he thought had died years ago. Dry Mesa in the daylight was a collection of sun-bleached wood and dusty glass. The main street was wide, rutted by wagon wheels and littered with horse manure. When Tashi and Evelyn rode in, the town stopped. The piano in the saloon went silent. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. Women walking with parasols froze on the boardwalks. It was a sight they had never seen. A Navajo warrior, sitting tall on a paint horse, his face like carved granite. And riding beside him, not bound, not crying, but sitting upright with a fierce dignity, was the white woman everyone said was dead or defiled. Evelyn looked straight ahead, ignoring the whispers that hissed like snakes from the shadows. "She is wearing their clothes. She is with him. Look at her." They rode straight to the sheriff's office, a brick building with iron bars on the windows. Sheriff Tom Rourke stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a big man with a walrus mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the worst of men. He rested his hand on his gun belt, but he did not draw. "Tashi Nez," Rourke said, his voice booming. "I heard you were running." "I'm not running," Tashi said, swinging down from his horse. He moved to help Evelyn down, but she slid off before he could touch her, landing firmly in the dust. "Sheriff Rourke," Evelyn said, her voice clear and ringing in the silence of the street. "I am Evelyn Hart, and I have a murder to report." Before Rourke could answer, a commotion erupted from the other end of the street. "Evie, my God, Evie!" Jared McAllen came running from the direction of the hotel. He was impeccably dressed in a black suit, a mourning band already tied around his arm. He looked at the picture of the distraught lover. He rushed toward her, his arms open. "Thank God, I thought I had lost you to these animals." Evelyn stepped back, her hand raised palm out. "Do not touch me." McAllen froze, his act faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "My dear, you are in shock. Look at you, dressed in those rags. What has he done to you?" He turned his gaze on Tashi, and the mask of love dropped, revealing the predator beneath. "Sheriff, arrest this man. He kidnapped my fiancée. He killed her father." "Liar!" Evelyn screamed. The sound shocked the crowd. "You killed him. I heard your voice in the canyon. Jared McAllen, you ordered your men to kill the witnesses." "You said you did not want a mess." A murmur rippled through the crowd. McAllen shook his head sadly, looking at the townsfolk with a pitying expression. "The poor girl. The trauma has broken her mind. She imagines monsters where there are none." He took a step closer to the sheriff, lowering his voice but making sure it carried. "Think, Tom. Why would I kill the reverend? He was bringing her to me. But this man," he pointed a manicured finger at Tashi. His people are angry about the railroad. The Reverend was going to sign the easement papers. That is the motive. Sheriff, savage, brutal motive. Tashi stood silent. He saw the way the crowd nodded. The lie was easier to swallow. It fits the shape of their prejudice. She speaks the truth, Tashi said quietly. Your men rode with masks, but horses leave tracks, and guns leave shells. Navajo lies. McAllen spat. Sheriff, if you do not arrest him, the boys and I will handle justice ourselves right here. Behind McAllen, 5 or 6 men, rough types, the kind who worked for the railroad security, shifted their coats, revealing the handles of their revolvers. Sheriff Rourke looked at Evelyn, standing defiant in her velvet blouse. He looked at Tashi, who stood ready to die but had not drawn his weapon. And he looked at McAllen, whose eyes were cold and hard as flint. Rourke knew something stank. He knew McAllen wanted the canyon. He knew the Reverend had been the only thing standing in the way of a legal war. But he had no proof. Only the word of a traumatized girl and an Indian against the richest man in the territory. Tashi Nez, Rourke said heavily. You are under arrest. No. Evelyn lunged forward, grabbing the sheriff's arm. You cannot. He saved me. I'm arresting him on suspicion, Rourke said. His eyes locked with Evelyn's. And for his own protection, if I let him walk, McAllen's men will shoot him in the back before he crosses the street. He turned to his deputy. Put him in the back cell, the one with the solid door, no visitors. And the girl, McAllen asked, reaching for Evelyn's arm again. I will take her home. She needs a doctor and rest. Evelyn recoiled. I will not go with you. You have no family here. Miss Hart, Rourke said gently, and no money, until the circuit judge comes next week to hear your testimony. You are a ward of the town. Mr. McAllen is your legal fiancé. I would rather sleep in the street, Evelyn hissed. Come now. Evie, McAllen said, his grip tightening on her arm like a steel trap. You are hysterical. We will get you out of these heathen clothes, and you will feel much better. He pulled her away. Evelyn looked back, her eyes finding Tashi's. Tashi did not fight as the deputy cuffed his hands. He watched McAllen drag Evelyn toward the large Victorian house on the hill. He saw the way the townspeople looked at him with fear, with hate, with curiosity. He was shoved into the sheriff's office, then through a heavy oak door into the cell block. The cell was small, smelling of lye and old urine. The deputy removed the cuffs and slammed the iron door shut. The key turned with a final, heavy clank. Tashi stood in the center of the cell. It was silent here. The stone walls dampened the sounds of the street. This was what he had wanted. Wasn't it to be away from the noise, to be alone? He sat on the narrow cot and put his head in his hands. The silence pressed in on him. But it was not the peaceful silence of the high mesa. It was a hollow, aching void. He closed his eyes and tried to find his center, but all he could hear was the ghost of a whimper and the phantom sensation of a small, warm hand resting over his heart. Hostine Bege was right. Silence without her voice was just a deep, dark hole. And for the first time in his life, Tashi Nez was truly afraid not of death, but of the silence that would follow it. The iron bars of the jail cell were cold against Tashi's forehead. He stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the town settling into an uneasy slumber. The air in the cell block was stale, smelling of wet stone and the lingering misery of men who had passed through before him. The heavy oak door creaked open, admitting a wedge of yellow lantern light. Sheriff Tom Rourke stepped inside, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. He carried a tin mug of coffee, the steam rising in the cool night air. Rourke did not speak immediately. He hung the lantern on a hook and pulled up a stool. Sitting just outside the bars, he looked old tonight. The lines around his eyes deepened by exhaustion and a burden that seemed heavier than the star pinned to his chest. Black coffee, Rourke said, sliding the mug through the gap in the bars. Figured you wouldn't want sugar. Tashi took the cup. His hands were steady. I want nothing from this town. You might want to listen, Rourke said, his voice low. He took a sip from his own cup, staring into the dark corners of the room. I went to McAllen's office today to ask about the Reverend, to ask about the timeline. Tashi waited. Silence was his weapon, and he wielded it well. I saw the maps, Rourke continued, almost to himself. They were rolled up on his drafting table. I don't read surveyor marks well, but I know water. I know elevation. The line he wants. The line through the throat of the wolf. It requires a dam. A diversion. Rourke looked up, meeting Tashi's gaze. If he builds that rail line, he cuts the water to the upper plateau. Your village, the sheep, the corn. It will all dry up and blow away within 2 summers. We know. Tashi said, that is why we fight. That is why he killed the Reverend. Because the Reverend had a conscience. And he would have seen the map too. Rourke rubbed his face with a calloused hand. I took an oath to uphold the law. But the law is supposed to be fair. And what is happening here? Drying out a whole people to water a steam engine. That ain't justice. That is just slow murder. Suddenly, the night outside erupted. A bell began to clang furiously. The fire bell. Shouts echoed from the street. Fire, fire at the livery. It's spreading to the feed store. Rourke stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the stone. Damn it, he swore. The livery is dry as tinder. He grabbed his hat and moved toward the door. He paused, his hand resting on the heavy ring of keys at his belt. He looked at Tashi, a long, measuring look. I have to go, Rourke said. I might be gone for a long while. It takes every hand to fight a fire in this wind. He unhooked the keys. He did not hand them to Tashi. Instead, he dropped them on the stool he had just vacated. They landed with a heavy clink, shining in the lantern light, just inches from the bars. I am getting old, Rourke muttered. Forgetful. Leaving my keys lying around, he turned to the prisoner. Tashi Nez, if you walk out that door, you are a fugitive. But if you stay, you are a corpse. McAllen's men are talking about a hanging tree come morning. If I go, Tashi said, I will stop him. Do not make me hunt you for killing innocent folks, Rourke warned. I only kill wolves. Tashi replied, the sheep are safe. Rourke nodded once, then turned and ran out the door, plunging the room back into shadows. Tashi reached through the bars. His fingers closed around the cold iron of the keys. At the top of the hill, the McAllen mansion stood like a fortress overlooking the chaos below. From the window of the guest bedroom, which was truly a cell with velvet curtains, Evelyn Hart watched the orange glow of the fire rising from the edge of town. She turned back to the room. It was luxurious, filled with fine furniture that smelled of lemon oil, but the door was locked from the outside. Earlier that evening, Jared McAllen had stood in this very room. He had touched her cheek with a hand that felt like cold marble, smiling, that terrifying, empty smile. We will be married in 3 days, he had said. A quiet ceremony. You are grieving, after all. It will be very touching. The town will love you for it. I will never marry you, Evelyn had hissed. I know what you are. You are a smart girl, Evie. Don't be a foolish one. You have no father. You have no money. You are a woman alone in the territory. Without me, you are destitute. With me, you are a queen. All you have to do is forget. Forget the canyon. Forget the savage. He had left her then, confident in his power. But he had made a mistake. He had left the connecting door to his study slightly ajar, believing her broken spirit would keep her cowering in bed. Evelyn was not cowering. She was pressing her ear against the crack of the door. Voices drifted through. McAllen's smooth baritone and the rough, gravelly voice of his foreman. A man named Silas. The dynamite is set. Mr. McAllen. Silas was saying, 20 cases. We placed them along the structural fault line on the north face. Good, McAllen replied. The sound of glass clinking against a decanter followed. And the timing. Dawn, just as the sun hits the rim. It will look like a natural rock slide. The whole north wall will come down. It will fill the narrowest part of the pass. Perfect foundation for the trackbed. And it saves us 6 months of grading. And the Indian. We will pull him out of the cell tonight during the confusion. Shoot him in the back. Say he tried to escape. We will dump the body in the canyon before the blast. He will be buried under 10,000 tons of rock. No body, no investigation. Evelyn backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were going to blow up the sacred canyon. They were going to erase the valley's history and Tashi's grave in one singular explosion. She looked around the room frantically. She had to get out. She had to warn them. Her eyes landed on the vanity table. A silver hairbrush, a bottle of perfume, and a long, sturdy hairpin. She grabbed the pin. She ran to the French doors that opened onto the balcony. Locked. She jammed the pin into the mechanism, wiggling it as she had seen the boys do back home when they broke into the church pantry. It was not elegant, but desperation guided her hands. Click. The latch gave way. Evelyn threw the doors open and stepped out into the cool night air. The balcony was on the second floor, 20 feet above the garden. She ran back inside and stripped the heavy quilt and the linen sheets from the bed. Her hands shook, but she forced them to work, tying the corners together in wet, tight knots. She secured one end to the heavy mahogany railing of the balcony and threw the rest over the side. She didn't look down. She didn't think about her skirts tangling or her grip slipping. She climbed over the rail, the rough fabric burning her palms, and lowered herself into the darkness. Her feet hit the soft earth of the rose garden. She stumbled but kept her balance. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light from the house windows. She made her way to the stables. The groom was gone, likely watching the fire in town. Evelyn found a saddled horse, McAllen's own black mare. She didn't struggle with the stirrups. Adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She mounted, grabbed the reins, and kicked the horse into a gallop. Charging out of the estate and into the black mouth of the desert, the trail to the canyon was treacherous by moonlight. Shadows played tricks on the eyes, turning cacti into men and rocks into crouching beasts. Tashi rode hard. He had stolen a horse from the hitching rail behind the saloon while the town fought the fire. He pushed the animal, knowing that every second counted. He didn't know about the dynamite, but he knew McAllen's men would be coming for him. And he knew he had to reach the canyon, his only sanctuary, his only fortress. He rounded a sharp bend in the trail, his rifle balanced across his saddle horn. Suddenly, another rider burst from the brush ahead, thundering toward him. Tashi reacted on instinct. He pulled the horse up hard, the animal rearing, and leveled his rifle. "Hold!" he shouted. The other rider pulled back, the black mare skidding in the loose gravel. "Don't shoot!" a woman's voice. Tashi froze. "Evelyn! Tashi!" They brought their horses together. The animals blowing hard, their flanks heaving in the moonlight. Evelyn looked wild. Her hair had come loose, streaming around her shoulders. Her velvet blouse was torn at the sleeve. "You are free!" she gasped, reaching out to touch his arm as if to verify he was real. "The sheriff has a blind eye." Tashi said, "Why are you here? You should be hiding." "There is no time," Evelyn said, the words tumbling out. "McAllen. He is going to blow up the canyon. At dawn. Dynamite. He wants to cause a rock slide to bury the past and build his railroad." Tashi felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. The canyon walls, they are the bones of the earth. If he breaks them, the water will vanish underground. "He is there now," Evelyn said. "With his men. We have to stop him." Tashi looked at the eastern horizon. A faint line of gray was already bleeding into the black. Dawn was less than 1 hour away. "Go back," Tashi commanded. "This is not a place for you." "No," Evelyn said. Her voice was not the soft whimper of the cabin. It was the growl of a mountain cat. "My father died on that road. I will not let him destroy the land he died on. I ride with you." Tashi looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He nodded once, then ride close and pray. The throat of the wolf was gray with the pre-dawn light when they arrived. The air was still, holding its breath before the sunrise. Below, on the canyon floor, activity buzzed like a disturbed hive. Lanterns bobbed in the twilight. Men were shouting orders, carrying wooden crates toward the base of the sheer northern cliff face. "Careful with that wire," a voice shouted. It was Silas. "One spark, and we all go to hell early." Tashi and Evelyn dismounted on the high ridge, hidden by a cluster of boulders. They could see McAllen standing near the temporary wooden bridge that spanned the narrowest part of the gorge. He was checking his pocket watch. "He is going to trigger it from the bridge," Tashi whispered. "See the plunger box?" Evelyn saw it. A wooden box with a T-handle, connected to a long line of wires snakes toward the cliff. "We have to cut the wires," Tashi said. "You can't get down there without being seen." Evelyn argued. "There are 12 men." "I am a scout," Tashi said. "I am invisible." "No," Evelyn said, grabbing his arm. "Distraction. They need to look away. I will go down. I will face him." "You will get killed." "He won't shoot me," Evelyn said bitterly. "He needs me to make his land grab legal. He needs a wife, not a corpse. I will draw them out. You cut the wire." Before Tashi could stop her, she mounted the black mare and kicked it forward. She rode openly down the scree slope, her silhouette stark against the lightening sky. "McAllen!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. Down below, every head turned. Jared McAllen looked up, shock registering on his face. "Evelyn!" he shouted. Evelyn rode straight onto the wooden bridge, stopping her horse in the center, blocking the path to the detonator. "Stop this!" she yelled. "I know what you are doing. I know you killed my father." McAllen signaled his men to hold their fire. He walked slowly onto the bridge, a smile that was more a snarl fixing on his face. "My dear Evie," he said, his voice carrying in the acoustic perfection of the canyon. "You really are a troublesome woman. Come down from that horse." "Look at him," Evelyn shouted to the workers, to the men from town who had ridden out to watch the spectacle. "He is a murderer. He is destroying the treaty land." Some of the workers exchanged uneasy glances. Even Sheriff Rourke, who had arrived with a posse just minutes before, stood at the edge of the canyon floor, watching. "She is mad," McAllen shouted to the crowd. "Grief has taken her mind," while all eyes were fixed on the drama on the bridge. A shadow moved among the rocks at the base of the cliff. Tashi Nez moved like smoke. He reached the bundle of wires running from the dynamite. He drew his knife. But Silas, the foreman, was vigilant. He spotted the movement. "Indian," Silas yelled, raising his rifle. "By the charges!" McAllen spun around. He saw Tashi. "Kill him!" McAllen roared. Silas fired. The bullet missed Tashi but struck the rock inches from his face, sending stone splinters flying. Tashi returned fire, dropping Silas with a single shot to the shoulder. Chaos erupted. The workers scrambled for cover. McAllen's hired guns opened fire on Tashi. McAllen, seeing his plan unraveling, grabbed the bridle of Evelyn's horse. He yanked the animal hard, causing it to rear. Evelyn was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the wooden planks of the bridge. McAllen hauled her up, wrapping his arm around her throat. Using her body as a shield, he pulled his revolver and aimed it at Tashi, who was breaking cover to run toward the bridge. "Stop or she dies!" McAllen screamed. Tashi froze. He stood 30 yards away, his rifle raised, but he could not shoot. Evelyn was directly in the line of fire. "You lose, savage!" McAllen laughed, his eyes wild. "I win, I always win." He pointed his gun not at Tashi, but at the crates of dynamite stacked near the bridge support, which had not yet been wired in. "If I can't have the railroad, no one has the canyon." "No," Evelyn screamed, biting his hand. McAllen flinched, and his gun fired. The bullet did not hit the crates. It hit a single stick of dynamite that had fallen out of a broken box during the earlier work. The explosion was not the earth-shattering blast they had planned, but it was close enough. Boom! The shockwave knocked everyone to the ground. The explosion blew out the main support beam of the wooden bridge. The structure groaned, a terrible sound of tearing wood and screaming nails. Then, the bridge buckled. The cliff face above, destabilized by the blast, began to slide. Massive boulders, the size of houses, detached and fell in slow motion. Dust billowed up, choking the air. The bridge tilted violently. Evelyn slid toward the edge. "Tashi!" she screamed. Tashi sprinted. He ran through the falling rocks, through the dust, onto the collapsing bridge. He threw himself flat, reaching out. He caught Evelyn's hand just as the floorboards beneath her gave way. He hauled her up, pulling her onto the solid rock of the ledge just as the bridge disintegrated, crashing into the dry riverbed 200 feet below. Silence followed the crash, broken only by the rumble of settling stones, then a cry for help. Tashi crawled to the edge and looked down. Jared McCallan was not dead. He was dangling over the abyss, clinging to a frayed rope that was caught on a protruding root. His feet kicked in the empty air. His face was white with terror, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his skin. "Help me!" McCallan screamed, his voice high and thin. "Pull me up. I'll give you anything, $10,000, the deed to the valley. Anything." Tashi stared down at the man. This was the face of the enemy. This was the man who had burned his village in spirit. If not in fact, this was the man who had killed the Reverend Hart. Evelyn crawled to Tashi's side. She looked down at the monster. She looked at Tashi. "He deserves to fall," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tashi looked at his hands. They were shaking. He remembered the promise he had made to himself. "I will not be the savage they say I am." He looked across the canyon. Sheriff Rourke and the townsfolk were watching. They were waiting to see what the Indian would do if he let him drop. He was a murderer in their eyes. If he saved him, he was a man. Tashi reached down. He grabbed the rope. "No," Tashi said, his voice cutting through the dust. "You do not buy your life. I will give it to you." With a grunt of effort, Tashi pulled. His muscles strained, the veins in his neck bulging. He hauled the heavy weight of Jared McCallan up, inch by inch, until the man scrambled over the lip of the cliff, collapsing in a heap of expensive wool and terror. McCallan lay there, gasping, vomiting in the dirt. Sheriff Rourke walked up, his gun drawn. He looked at McCallan, then at Tashi. He holstered his gun and pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs. "Jared McCallan," Rourke said, his voice grim. "You are under arrest for the murder of Reverend Hart and the attempted murder of, well, just about everybody." Rourke clicked the cuffs onto McCallan's wrists. The sound was sharp and final. McCallan looked up, his eyes hateful. "You can't do this. I own this town." "Not anymore," Rourke said. "The railroad doesn't like bad publicity, and blowing up a canyon is bad for business." Tashi stood up, dusting off his knees. He looked at Evelyn. She was covered in dust, her hands scraped and bleeding, but she was alive. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no fear, no hesitation. She stepped forward and buried her face in his chest. Tashi stood there, the dust of the explosion swirling around them like snow. He wrapped his arms around her. The silence of the canyon returned, but it was not the silence of death. It was the silence of a storm that has finally passed. He looked over Evelyn's head at the rising sun. The light hit the red rocks, turning them the color of blood and fire. But for the first time in 10 years, the sunrise did not look like an ending. It looked like a beginning. The dust from the explosion hung in the air for 3 days, a fine red mist that coated the throat of the canyon like dried blood. The north wall of the pass was scarred, a jagged wound of fresh, pale stone exposed against the weathered iron red of the ancient cliffs. The blast had done its work, but not the work Jared McCallan had intended. Instead of creating a smooth bed for a railroad track, the collapse had filled the narrowest choke point with a chaotic jumble of boulders the size of houses. The bridge was gone. The way was shut. The surveyors looked at the mess and shook their heads. To clear that rubble would take 5 years and more money than the railroad company in Chicago was willing to spend on a gamble. The Iron Snake had been stopped, not by a treaty, but by the mountain itself. Down on the canyon floor, the silence that followed the arrest of Jared McCallan was heavier than the explosion. Sheriff Tom Rourke did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who was finally correcting a ledger that had been unbalanced for too long. Rourke gathered the papers from McAllen's saddlebags. He found the maps with the water diversions marked in red ink. He found the deeds signed with X marks by men who could not read what they were signing away. "I made a mistake," Rourke said, standing before the gathered crowd of railway workers and townsfolk. He did not shout. He spoke to the ground, then raised his eyes to meet theirs. "I let a man with a silver tongue buy my common sense. I owe this territory an apology." He turned to McAllen, who sat in the dirt, his expensive suit ruined, his hands bound in iron. The tycoon looked small now, without his desk, without his hired guns, without the fear he instilled. He was just a man who had gambled and lost everything. "You are a fool, Rourke," McAllen spat, though his voice lacked its usual venom. "Progress will not stop because of one sheriff and a savage." "Maybe not," Rourke said, hoisting McAllen to his feet. "But it will stop today, and it will stop here." The sheriff looked up at the ledge where Tashi and Evelyn stood. "I will need statements." Rourke called up, "But not today. Take him home. Miss Hart. He looks like he went 10 rounds with a grizzly." Tashi did not look like a victor. He looked like a man who had survived a landslide. His shirt was shredded, his back laced with cuts from flying shale, and his left arm hung stiffly at his side, bruised deep to the bone. He did not ride his horse back to the cabin. He let Evelyn lead it while he walked, his hand resting on the animal's neck for balance. They moved slowly through the cooling afternoon, leaving the noise of the law and the town behind them. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, yet it felt entirely different. It was no longer a hiding place. It was a house that they had fought to keep. Evelyn guided Tashi to the bed, the same bed she had occupied for days while he slept on the floor. She pushed him down gently by his good shoulder. "Sit," she commanded. Tashi tried to protest. "It is just scratches. I have had worse from a cactus." "Sit," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. She busied herself with the fire, heating water in the iron kettle. She tore strips from her own petticoats, ruining the last piece of clothing she owned that connected her to the east. She did not care. When the water was hot, she came to him. "Take off your shirt." Tashi hesitated. He was a private man. His body was a map of his history, and he did not like people reading it. But he saw the look in Evelyn's eyes. It was not the look of a stranger. It was the look of a woman who had ridden into gunfire for him. He unbuttoned the ruined calico shirt and let it slide off his shoulders. Evelyn drew a sharp breath. His back was a tapestry of violence. There were the fresh, angry red welts from the rock slide, oozing blood and grit. But beneath them were the old scars, the long, pale slash of a cavalry saber, the puckered round mark of a bullet, and the thin, silvery lines of the lash souvenirs from a time he rarely spoke of. She dipped the cloth in the warm water and began to clean him. Her touch was firm, but infinitely gentle. She washed away the dust of the canyon. She washed away the dried blood. Tashi sat rigid at first, flinching as the cloth touched the raw skin. But as she continued, finding a rhythm, his shoulders began to drop. The tension that he carried like a second skeleton began to dissolve under her hands. "This one?" Evelyn whispered, her fingers tracing a jagged scar that ran from his shoulder blade to his rib cage. "Where did this come from?" Tashi stared at the fire. The silence in the cabin was thick, but it was not empty. "The long walk," he said. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest that she could feel against her hand. "Huildi, 1864. The soldiers made us walk 300 miles to the Bosque Redondo. I was a boy. I fell behind because I was carrying my younger sister. A soldier struck me with his bayonet to make me move faster." Evelyn stopped washing. Her hand rested flat against the scar. "And your sister? She died at the river," Tashi said. He did not weep. He had spent all his tears 20 years ago. The water was too cold. The walk was too long. He turned slightly, looking at Evelyn over his shoulder. "I learned then that to love something is to invite pain. If I had not loved her, I would not have carried her. If I had not carried her, I would not have this mark. I swore I would never love anything that could be taken away. I chose silence because silence cannot die. Evelyn moved around to face him. She took the cloth and wiped the soot from his cheek. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what he was sharing. "You are wrong, Tashi," she said softly. "Silence can die. It dies when you are alone in the dark, and there is no one to hear you breathe. That is the death of the soul." She dropped the cloth into the basin. The water turned pink with his blood. "Those nights," Evelyn confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I first came here, when I cried in my sleep, I knew you were there. I heard your boots on the floorboards. You would walk to the bed, and you would stop. You never touched me. You never spoke, but I could feel you standing guard." She looked down at her hands, the hands that had held a gun, the hands that had saved a man. "My father used to pray over me, and I felt safe, but hearing you stand in the dark, just breathing, protecting a woman you did not even want, that made me feel more safe than any prayer." Tashi reached out. He took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from the rope and the rifle, but his grip was tender. "I wanted a life untouched by women," he admitted. "I thought my heart was a stone, but that first night, when you whimpered in your sleep, the sound went into the wood of the walls. It went into the fire. It went into me. I tried to push it out, but it was like a hook. You woke up the part of me that I thought was dead." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I do not want silence anymore. Evelyn, not if it means you are not there to break it." Outside, the sky opened up. Rain began to fall. A gentle, steady drumming on the roof. It was not the violent storm that had torn the shingles days ago. It was a healing rain, the kind that washed the dust from the sagebrush and made the desert smell of creation. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Evelyn stepped closer, until her knees brushed against his. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the high cheekbones, the mouth that had been set in a grim line for so long. "I am not going back to the east," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere." Tashi stood up. He winced slightly from his injuries, but he ignored the pain. He towered over her, but he leaned down, reducing the distance until their breaths mingled. He kissed her forehead first. It was a benediction, a promise. Then he tilted her face up and kissed her mouth. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the language of touch. "Is this real? Are we allowed this?" Evelyn answered by wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, pressing her body against his. The kiss deepened. It was the collision of two worlds that had been kept apart by maps and laws and fear. It tasted of rain and smoke and survival. It was the hunger of a man who had starved himself of affection for a decade, and the relief of a woman who had finally found a place where she did not have to be a doll in a parlor. Tashi lifted her, carrying her not to the guest bed, but to the rugs by the fire. He laid her down, the firelight turning her skin to gold. He moved over her, his weight supported on his elbows to protect her, his dark hair falling forward to curtain them from the rest of the room. There were no more words. The wind outside sighed around the corners of the cabin, but inside, the silence was finally broken. It was replaced by the sounds of skin against skin, of soft gasps, of the rustle of clothing being discarded like old lives that no longer fit. The fire burned low, turning to glowing embers. The shadows merged until they were one, and in the sanctuary of the high mesa, under the roof they had mended together, the warrior and the virgin laid down their armor and found the peace that neither had believed existed. The next morning brought a clarity to the air that stung the lungs. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, scrubbed clean by the rain. News traveled up the mountain before noon. A rider from the sheriff's office, a young deputy who looked at Tashi with a newfound respect, brought the word. "They took McAllen at dawn," the deputy said, keeping his horse well back from the cabin door. "Sheriff Rourke and 2 marshals are taking him to Santa Fe." The judge there is a hanging judge. They say McAllen will trade his silk suits for a rope before the leaves turn. Tashi stood on the porch, his arm in a sling that Evelyn had fashioned. He nodded. And the railroad. Stopped, the deputy said. Engineers say the canyon is unstable. They are moving the line 40 miles south. It will bypass Dry Mesa, but I reckon we will survive. Better to be a small town with water than a big city with none. The deputy tipped his hat to Evelyn, who stood in the doorway wearing her Navajo blouse. Ma'am, folks in town? Well, there is a lot of talk, but Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, said to tell you that she kept your trunks safe, and that if you need yeast, you are welcome to come by. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, but in the language of the frontier, it was an olive branch. It was an admission. We were wrong. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Hostine Bigay rode a mule up the trail. Behind him, riding double and clinging to the old man's waist, was a boy of perhaps 10 years. The boy was thin, with eyes that were too big for his face and hair that had been chopped short in the manner of the mission schools. He wore trousers that were too short and a shirt that had been mended a dozen times. Bigay slid off the mule with a groan of old bones. He helped the boy down. This is Kani, Bigay said, pushing the boy gently forward. His parents died of sickness 2 winters ago. He has been living with the sheep herders, but he has too much fire to watch sheep. He fights. He runs away. Tashi looked at the boy. Kani looked back, his chin lifted in defiant fear. It was like looking into a mirror that showed the past. Tashi saw the same anger, the same loneliness, the same desperate need for a place to belong. Why do you bring him here? Grandfather, Tashi asked. Because a warrior who fights only for himself is just a killer, Bigay said. You have a woman now. You have a home, but a home needs a future. The old man looked at Evelyn. He speaks the white man's tongue, but he hates it. He needs to learn that a tongue is just a tool, like a knife. You can use it to cut bread or to cut throats. He needs to learn to cut bread. Bigay turned back to Tashi. And he needs to learn the old ways. He needs to know why we do not speak the names of the dead, and how to walk so the deer do not hear. You have much silence in you. Tashi, give some of it to the boy, so he can learn to listen. It was not a request. It was an assignment. Tashi looked at Kani. Do you know how to chop wood? The boy nodded. I chopped wood at the mission. They said I was lazy. Here, Tashi said, pointing to the wood pile. If you are lazy, the fire goes out and you freeze. It is a simple lesson. Kani looked at the axe. He looked at Tashi. Then he walked over, picked up the heavy tool, and swung it. The log split cleanly. Evelyn watched, her heart swelling until she thought it might burst. She stepped inside the cabin to fetch cups for water. On the table, next to the Bible, lay a letter that the deputy had brought along with the news. It was addressed to Miss Evelyn Hart, in the cramped, spidery handwriting of her Aunt Martha in Boston. Evelyn picked it up. She could almost smell the lavender sachets and the coal smoke of the city. She opened it. My dearest Evelyn, we have heard the most dreadful rumors. A savage abduction. Your poor father. You must come home immediately. I have arranged for a ticket. Do not let your life be ruined by this tragedy. You can still have a decent life here, perhaps as a governess, if we are discreet about your time in the wild. Evelyn read the words. Decent life, discreet, ruined. She looked out the window. She saw the red cliffs burning in the sunset. She saw the man she loved showing a motherless boy how to check a horse's hoof. She saw a world that was hard, violent, and unforgiving, but also honest. Decent, she whispered, tasting the word. It tasted like ash. She walked to the hearth. The fire was crackling, fed by the wood the boy had just chopped. Evelyn held the letter over the flames. She watched the paper curl. She watched the ink darken and vanish. She dropped it. It flared up bright and hot for a second, then crumbled into gray flakes. She turned and walked out onto the porch. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the yard. Tashi was sitting on the bench, mending a bridle. Connie was sitting on the step below him, watching his hands. Tashi looked up as she came out. He saw empty hands. He saw the peace in her face. He knew about the letter. The deputy had mentioned it. He asked no questions. Evelyn sat down beside him. She picked up a wooden bowl and a spoon. "Supper will be ready soon," she said. The three of them sat there as the light faded. The silence of the evening settled around them. But it was not the terrified silence of the canyon ambush. It was not the lonely silence of the hermit's cabin. It was a silence filled with life. It was filled with the sound of Connie's breathing as he focused on the leatherwork. It was filled with the soft scrape of the spoon against the wood. It was filled with the beat of three hearts that had found their rhythm together. Tashi Nez looked at the woman, then at the boy, then out at the darkening land. He took a deep breath of the cool air. He had longed for silence his whole life, but he had been wrong about what it meant. Silence was not the absence of noise. It was the absence of fear, and for the first time in his life, the warrior was truly at peace. The seasons turned over the high plateau of dry mesa like the turning of a heavy page in a well-worn book. The scorching heat of summer, which had fueled the fires of conflict and tempered the steel of men like Tashi Nez, eventually gave way to the golden, melancholy light of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the river turned a brilliant yellow, standing like lit torches against the red sandstone cliffs. Change, when it finally came to the territory, did not arrive with the roar of dynamite or the whistle of a steam engine. It came quietly, carrying on the wind of small, daily acts of understanding. On the outskirts of Dry Mesa, where the dusty town limits blurred into the open sagebrush, a new building had risen. It was modest, built of planed lumber and whitewashed to reflect the sun, with a bell tower that held a bell salvaged from a decommissioned mission. Inside, the air smelled of chalk dust and pine shavings. Evelyn Hart stood at the front of the room, wiping a slate board clean. Before her sat 12 children. 7 were the sons and daughters of shopkeepers and ranchers from the town. 5 were dying Navajo children who rode down from the mesas on ponies that waited patiently in the shade outside. "Water," Evelyn said, writing the word in neat, looping script on the slate. She turned to the class, her velvet Navajo blouse contrasting with the prim schoolteacher's skirt she wore. "In English, we say water, and in Dine." She looked at a small boy in the front row, Connie. He sat straighter now, his hair still short, but his eyes bright and devoid of the haunted look he had arrived with months ago. "Two," Connie said clearly. "Two," the white children repeated, the strange syllable rolling awkwardly but earnestly off their tongues. It was a small thing, a single word. But in a land where language had been used as a weapon to deceive and to conquer, the sharing of a word was the first step toward a treaty that could not be broken by politicians. Outside, the sound of hooves approached. Evelyn looked out the window and smiled. Tashi Nez sat atop his paint horse, waiting. He did not wear the uniform of a scout, nor the war paint of a renegade. He wore a clean shirt, a vest of soft buckskin, and the silver concho belt that was his family's legacy. Pinned to his vest, small and unobtrusive, was a silver badge, not the star of a sheriff, but a special deputy's badge commissioned by Sheriff Tom Rourke. Tashi was no longer the ghost of the mountain. He had become the bridge. When disputes arose over grazing rights or water access, it was Tashi whom Rourke called. He spoke the law of the white man, but he thought with the heart of Dine. He had found a way to fight for his people without a rifle. As the children spilled out of the schoolhouse for the midday break, running and shouting in a chaotic mix of 2 languages, Tashi dismounted. He walked with a slight limp. The memory of the rock slide would stay with him when the weather turned cold, but he moved with a quiet authority that commanded respect. A rancher named Miller, the same man who had once spat on the ground when Tashi walked by, drove his wagon past. He slowed, nodded to Tashi, and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon." "Deputy," Miller said. "Afternoon, Miller," Tashi replied. It was not friendship, it was not forgiveness, but it was civilization. The town had seen the truth of Jared McAllen, who was now rotting in a federal prison in Santa Fe, awaiting the hangman's noose, and in seeing the monster that lived in a silk suit, they had been forced to reevaluate the man who lived in a log cabin. Evelyn walked out to meet him. She didn't care who was watching. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his vest, her hand lingering on his chest. "Is the council meeting over?" she asked. "It is," Tashi said. His voice was still the deep, rumbling baritone that had once terrified her, but the edge was gone. "The army has agreed to respect the new boundaries. The water remains ours." "Then we have peace," Evelyn said. "We have a pause," Tashi corrected gently. "But a pause is enough to plant corn, and enough to build a room." They rode back up the mountain together as the sun began to dip. The cabin, perched on its ledge, looked different now. It was no longer a hermit's fortress. A new room had been added to the north side, built of sturdy ponderosa logs. It had been a community raising. Hostine Bigay had brought the men from the village to cut the timber. Sheriff Rourke had brought a wagon load of nails and shingles from the town. For 3 days, men who had shot at each other across canyons worked side by side, sweating and cursing the stubborn wood, bound together by the simple, undeniable reality that a man and a woman needed space to live. Beside the heavy front door, 2 objects hung on the rough wood. On the left was a small, simple wooden cross, the one Evelyn had taken from her father's neck. On the right hung a dream catcher, woven of willow and sinew, decorated with the feathers of a red-tailed hawk, a gift from Hostine Bigay's niece. They moved in the breeze, touching occasionally. 2 prayers, 2 histories, guarding the same threshold. That evening, the air turned chill. Winter was coming early to the high country. Inside the cabin, the fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm, amber glow over the rugs and the books that now lined a shelf Tashi had built. Evelyn stood by the window, looking out at the darkening valley. She placed her hand on her stomach. There was no swell yet, nothing the eye could see, but she knew. She felt the subtle shift in her body, the new rhythm of life taking hold. She had not told him yet. She had been waiting for the right moment, or perhaps she was just savoring the secret, holding it close like a precious stone. Tashi moved up behind her. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. His large, warm hands moved to rest over hers, covering her stomach. He went still. Evelyn leaned her head back against his shoulder, looking up at his profile. He was staring at their reflection in the dark glass of the window. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with a sudden, dawning realization. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He was a man who could track a deer across solid rock. He could feel the change in the woman he held. "A warrior," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Or a teacher," Evelyn smiled. "Or perhaps a bridge." Tashi turned her in his arms. The fear that had once defined his life, the fear of loss, the fear that anything he loved would be destroyed, flickered in his eyes for a second, then vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective joy. "A family," he said. The word felt strange and heavy on his tongue, but it was a good weight. Later that night, after Connie had climbed into the loft of the new room to sleep, Evelyn sat at the table with her journal. An oil lamp flickered beside her. Next to it lay a letter from a young woman in Tucson, a stranger who had heard the story of the school teacher of Dry Mesa and had written to ask for advice. "Dear Mrs. Nez," the letter read, "I am told you survived the worst of this land. I am told you married a man of the desert. My heart feels like it is hardening every day against the cruelty of the West. How does one keep a soft heart here without being crushed?" Evelyn dipped her pen in the inkwell. She looked at Tashi, who was sitting by the fire, mending a stirrup leather. He looked up, meeting her gaze with a steady, quiet warmth. She looked back at the paper and began to write. "My dear friend, you ask how to keep from turning to stone. I once asked the same question. I came here believing that I carried civilization in my books and my manners. I thought the silence of this land was empty and terrifying. But I have learned that silence is not the enemy. The enemy is the wall we build to keep others out. I thought silence was a shelter, a place to hide from pain. But I have learned that silence can also be a grave for all the things that matter. Silence is only beautiful when it is shared. It is only peace when it is the quiet space between two people who understand each other. A Navajo warrior taught me that the land remembers everything, the blood and the rain alike. We cannot choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we heal. To keep a soft heart, you must not be afraid to let it break. For it is in the healing that we become strong, not in the hiding. Silence is precious, like water, but like water. It must flow to be alive. A silence shared is like a windless night with the breathing of your beloved beside you. It is not empty. It is full. Yours in faith. Evelyn. She sanded the ink and closed the journal. Come, Tashi said, standing up. The moon is up. There is something we must see. They wrapped themselves in heavy blankets and walked out into the night. Kani, waking at the sound of the door, scrambled down from the loft, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and followed them like a shadow. Tashi led them not to the ridge, but along the trail that skirted the edge of the sacred canyon. The moon was full, bathing the world in a silver light that turned the red rocks to gray. They stood at the rim, looking down at the place where the bridge had once stood. The scar of the explosion was still raw. The white stone of the shattered cliff face gleamed in the moonlight, a stark contrast to the ancient, weathered rock around it. The pile of rubble that blocked the pass was a chaotic monument to the violence that had occurred there. It is ugly, Kani whispered, looking at the destruction. It is a wound, Tashi corrected him. He crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. But look. He pointed to the base of the rubble, where the moonlight caught the glimmer of water. The stream, blocked by the rocks, had pooled and found a new path, trickling over the stones, creating a small waterfall that hadn't been there before. And in the damp earth near the water, small shoots of green were already pushing up through the dust. The earth does not forget, Tashi said, his voice low, carrying on the wind. It remembers the dynamite, it remembers the anger, but it does not stop. It takes the scar and makes a new path. It makes new life. He stood up and put his arm around Evelyn, pulling her close against the chill. We are like this canyon, Tashi said to her. We have our scars. I carry the long walk on my back. You carry the death of your father in your eyes. But we do not hide them. We live so that the new marks we make are better than the old ones. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. And the railroad. The iron snake has moved south, Tashi said. The silence here belongs to us again. They stood for a long time, 3 silhouettes against the vast, star-dusted sky. The past was there, etched in stone, but the future was flowing like the water, unstoppable, persistent, and alive. They returned to the cabin as the night deepened. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals. The room was warm and smelled of sage and family. Kani curled up on a rug near the hearth, refusing to go back to the loft. He wanted to be close to the heat, close to the people who had claimed him. Within minutes, his breathing evened out into the deep, rhythmic sleep of a child who knows he is safe. Evelyn lay in the bed, the heavy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She watched Tashi as he checked the lock on the door, a habit he would never break, and one she no longer resented. He blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the red glow of the embers. Tashi sat in the chair by the door, his boots resting on the wood floor. He closed his eyes and listened. Outside, far across the valley, a coyote howled a lonely, high-pitched song that rose and fell with the wind. It was the sound of the wild, the sound of the untamed West, but inside the cabin, there was a different sound. There was the soft, steady breathing of Kani. There was the gentle rustle of Evelyn shifting in the bed. Tashi smiled in the darkness. He remembered the night he had brought her here. He remembered the virgin soft whimpers that had haunted him, the sounds of terror and nightmare that had threatened to tear his world apart. Those sounds were gone. Now, the silence was filled with the peaceful rhythm of a woman sleeping without fear, and the dreams of a child who had a father. It was not the silence of the grave. It was not the silence of the hermit. It was a living silence. It was a conversation without words. Tashi Nez, the warrior who had longed for silence, finally understood. He had not been looking for an absence of sound. He had been looking for this. He leaned his head back against the rough logs of the wall. The west was still a hard place. The wind still blew cold, and the world was still dangerous. But in this cabin, on this high ledge between the earth and the sky, the silence was finally, perfectly complete. It was no longer an escape. It was love. The fire is dying down now. Friends, and the stars are wheeling overhead. That is the way it happened. Or at least, that is the way the wind tells it if you listen close enough near the red cliffs of Arizona. It is a rare thing for a warrior to find peace without laying down his life, and rarer still for a heart to break and heal stronger than it was before. But out here, where the land is vast enough to hold all our sorrows, sometimes, just sometimes, silence is the loudest song of all. Thank you, kind traveler, for sitting by my fire and listening to the tale of Tashi and Evelyn. It has been a long journey from the dusty trails of the east to the high mesas of the Navajo lands. I would love to know whose company I have been keeping tonight. Please, leave a comment below and tell me where in this wide world you are listening from. It brings an old writer joy to know how far the smoke from his campfire drifts. If this story touched your spirit, please consider subscribing to Wild West Tales. Give the video a like, and if you truly want to help these stories reach more ears, hit that hype button. It helps keep the fire burning bright for the next tale. Until we meet again on the trail, keep your powder dry and your heart soft.